Silver bells all seem to say, throw cares away. Christmas is here, bringing good cheer to young and old, meek and the bold, ding and the dong, loud is their song, with joyful ring, all carol
Mary had a baby, yes, Lord. Mary had a baby, yes, my Lord. Mary had a baby, yes, Lord. Keep her coming and the train don't go. Where did she lay him? Yes, Lord. Laid him in the manger, yes, my Lord. Wrapped him in the swaddling, yes, Lord. Keep her coming and the train don't go.
Mary had a baby,
Yes, Lord.
Mary had a baby,
Yes, my Lord.
Mary had a baby,
Yes, Lord. Keep her coming and the train don't go. What did she name him?
yes, Lord,
Named him King Jesus.
yes, my Lord,
Wonderful Counselor. Yes, Lord. Mary had a baby. Yes, Lord. Mary had a baby. Yes, my Lord. Mary had a baby. Yes, Lord. Keep her coming and the train will come and go. Keep her coming and the people keep her coming and the people keep her coming and the train will come and go. And the train does
On the first day of Christmas, my true love sent to me a partridge in a pear tree.
On the second day of Christmas, my true love sent to me 2 turtle doves and a partridge in a pear tree.
On the third day of Christmas, my true love sent to me 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree.
On the fourth day of Christmas, my true love sent to me 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the fifth day of Christmas, my true love sent to me 5 holidays, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the sixth day of Christmas, my true love sent to me 6 geese a laying, 5 goldings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree.
On the seventh day of Christmas, my true love sent to me 7 swans a swimming, 6 geese a laying,
5 goldings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the eighth day of Christmas, my true love sent to me
8 maids a milking, 7 swans a swimming, 6 geese a laying,
5 goldings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the ninth day of Christmas, my true love sent to me 9 ladies dancing, 8 maids a milking, 7 swans a swimming, 6 geese a laying, 5 goldings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the 10th day of Christmas, my true love sent to me 10
lords a leaping, 9 ladies dancing, 8 maids a milking, 7 swans a swimming, 6 geese a laying, 5
goldings,
4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves,
and a partridge in a pear tree. On the 11th day of Christmas, my true love sent to me 11 rappers piping, 10 lords a leaping, 9 ladies dancing, 8 maids a milking, 7 swans a swimming, 6 geese a laying, 5 goldings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the 12th day of Christmas, my true love sent to me 12 lords a leaping, 10 lords a leaping, 9 ladies dancing, 8 maids a
very good morning. Welcome to BBC One on Friday, the 22nd of December. Business Breakfast follows in a few moments.
This is the Queen's Parish Church.
Alan Bennett takes you on a tour of Westminster Abbey.
The English have always been cliquey, and the burial and memorial customs of the Abbey contrive to make them as cliquey in death as they are in life. The most obvious clique being Poets' Corner. It's the English liking for clubs. And of course it means that when the last trump sounds, there won't be any awkward standing about like there is at the start of a party. Of course, a lot of them will be talking shop, but that's the English idea of heaven anyway.
One of Britain's great institutions on another. Alan Bennett on the Abbey, a 3-part special starting on Christmas Day at 9 on BBC Two.
This is BBC One. Breakfast news begins in an hour. First, at 6 o'clock, we join Sarah Coburn and Janet Barry for Business Breakfast.
Good morning, you're very welcome to join us on this, our last programme before Christmas, but fear not, we will be back again very early in the new year. And as usual, we've got a full rundown of the very latest business news.
Between now and 7, we'll also bring you your local news, the weather and the top sports stories.
The headlines this Friday morning: European fisheries ministers have reached agreement on fishing quotas after 14 hours of talks in Brussels. They agreed to take account of the needs of the fishing industry and to soften proposals for sharp cuts in quotas next year. 3 men have been killed and 4 others injured in an explosion at an oil rig construction yard on Tyneside. Workers at the AMEC plant at Howden had been testing pressure valves on a gas rig. Another row between BT and Oftel as the industry regulator wants new wide-ranging powers over the company. And the ghost of Christmas past and present. The TUC laments hundreds of thousands of long-term unemployed.
On the markets this morning, the Nikkei has hit another record high for the year. At the moment it's trading at 19,710.
Well, there is absolutely no escaping the rain today. The heaviest of it is likely to be in the north of England, but temperatures will be relatively mild. And for those of you looking for the snow, you'll have to go to the hills of northern Scotland to find it.
Coming up in the next hour, after AMEC's successful defence against Kverno, we ask the company's chairman, Sir Alan Cockshaw, whether the company now has any chance of staying independent. That's at 6:15. At 6:20, we present our review of the year. And at 6:45, Bronwyn Curtis of Deutsche Morgan Grenfell will be here to pick her way through the business pages.
All that coming up, but first a look at this morning's main news story. Within the past hour, European Union fisheries ministers have reached a deal to fix the size of catches for next year after 14 hours of talks in Brussels. They've agreed to soften proposals by the European Commission for cuts of up to 50% in catches of some types of fish to protect dwindling stocks. British fishermen have been leading a campaign against the reductions, and I'm joined now on the line from Brussels by our correspondent David Shookman. David, what does this deal mean for British fishermen?
It means that in some species, in some areas, the cuts that had been proposed by the European Commission based on scientific advice have been softened to an extent. I've just come from a briefing with the British Fisheries Minister, Tony Baldry, and I'm armed with a couple of examples to show you how these quotas have been changed slightly. For example, sole caught in the North Sea was going to be cut. The British quota was going to be cut from about 1,200 down by about half to about 600 tons next year. Now the Minister has managed to argue a fairly modest increase in that up to 900 tons. So that's a cut that was going to be about by half, now by about a quarter. In the case of whiting in the North Sea, where last year British fishermen landed about 30,000 tons, and next year we're going to be allowed only 23,000 tons. Again, there's been an increase in that proposed cut up to 27,000 tons. So there's been some shift in the position. Overall, though, in most species, in most areas, there will be some cuts for British and other fishermen. The scientific advice is apparently very compelling that unless some strong action is taken, notwithstanding the impact on fishing industry jobs and so forth, that fishing stocks will suffer. And I think what we may see after this overnight marathon session, which has seen some comfort given to fishermen, particularly in Britain, that we'll see the environmental lobby now kicking up in protest, saying that the politicians are seeing a short-term view in this. They're promoting the interests of their own parties and so forth, at the expense of the long-term future of the industry and of conservation in European waters.
David Shipman, thank you for talking to us.
Now the rest of this morning's news. 3 men have been killed and 4 other people slightly hurt in an explosion at the AMEC engineering yard on Tyneside. It happened at Howden as workers were testing pressure valves on a gas rig.
The men were on the top floor of the structure. They were testing a network of pipes by putting them under pressure with nitrogen gas. That's non-flammable, but there was a sudden leak which was described as like a bursting balloon. 9 fire engines were called as the module was evacuated. The 4 injured men were taken to hospital. Only a few days ago, AMEC was celebrating victory and fighting off a takeover of the company. They thought it was the setting for a perfect Christmas, but now all attention is focused on this morning's activity. The Health and Safety Executive has already begun an investigation into just what happened here, and in the meantime, all work has stopped on the rig.
The Irish government has dropped plans to release up to 10 IRA prisoners before Christmas. It's thought the move is directly related to the murder this week of 2 men in shootings in Belfast, which some security sources have blamed on the IRA. New research suggests that people under 45 with high blood pressure are 10 times more likely than others to suffer a stroke. One of the biggest ever studies into the problem is reported in the medical journal The Lancet.
Nancy James suffered a stroke 5 years ago. The 77-year-old will never be able to walk again. Doctors believe the detection of high blood pressure in her early 40s may have helped prevent Nancy's condition. It's long been known that high blood pressure greatly increases the chance of a stroke. Today's study quantifies that risk.
For people who are, say, in their 40s or 50s, that blood pressure is even more important than it was thought to be. And the people that's mostly relevant to are the people who've already had a small stroke and who don't want a big stroke. For them, blood pressure reduction could well be a matter of life or death.
The Stroke Association's now calling for doctors to identify patients at risk.
And those were the main news stories at 6 minutes past 6. Back to Sarah.
Relations between Oftel and BT have taken another battering after the industry regulator, Don Cruikshank, published his planned changes to the company's operating licence to combat what he called anti-competitive behaviour. Cable companies naturally welcomed the proposals, but say Oftel haven't gone far enough. BT, not surprisingly, is livid, and a referral to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission now looks inevitable. Well, with me is Neil McCartney. He is editor of FT Telecom Markets. Good morning to you. Of course, BT is going to be upset about this, but quite a lot of speculation in the press this morning that perhaps Don Cruikshank has gone too far. What do you think?
Well, I think we could say that, in that basically what the change is going to mean is that it will be up to the Director General to decide what and what is not anti-competitive behaviour, and that's what BT is upset about. They say that he's going to act as judge and jury in these cases, but he's not going to have the power to actually fine anybody. All he's going to be able to do is issue an order which then the aggrieved party has to take to court. So I think that possibly BT's overstating it. It's worth saying that everybody else says he's not going too far.
Well, now the MMC, it looks like they're going to be called into action yet again. Do you reckon that's the case? And if it is the case, what does that do to the entire industry? Presumably puts it in a state of limbo.
Yes, it would. I'm not sure that it will involve a referral to the MMC. I mean, BT is indicating that it might. But this has happened before. There have been several cases when Oftel has come to a judgment that BT has been unhappy with, and they've suggested they might refuse to accept it. But Oftel has suggested that if they were to make a referral this time, it would be under the Fair Trading Act rather than Telecommunications Act. What that would mean is that the MMC would have the power to look at a wide range of issues, including the possible breakup of BT itself. And I think BT might think twice before they risk that.
But it is, in fact, the second serious run-in between Oftel and BT this month. Earlier on in the month, there was this big saga about taking your phone number with you if you're leaving, as a customer, if you're leaving BT and moving to another one. And the MMC pretty much came down on the side of Oftel on that. How strained do you think relations are now between BT and Don Cruikshank?
Well, relations are extremely strained, and actually it's going to be one of the tasks of the new Chief Executive of BT, Peter Bonfield, to try and repair the relationship, because obviously it doesn't do either of them any good if relations continue like this. It's worth saying, though, that the number portability row is perhaps was not quite as important as this one would be. I mean, the amount of money one was talking about, 220 million over 5 years, is neither here nor there, frankly, as far as BT is concerned. And you could say that the whole process was useful for BT because the whole implementation of portability was put back while it was investigated. So I think a referral on this would be far more serious.
Neil McCartney, thank you for talking to us.
To the markets now, and a strong performance for equities so far in Tokyo. The Nikkei hit new highs for the year, and at the moment it's up 91 points at 19,744. And recovery on Wall Street too, where heavy trading pushed the Dow up almost 40 points, making good most of the 50-point drop on Wednesday. Dealers said this stronger performance was down to a glimmer of hope from the Senate Republican leader Bob Dole that some progress had been made in resolving the US budget crisis. A quiet time on the currency markets, with dealers retiring to the sidelines for Christmas. But that possible resolution of the US budget crisis did offer some stimulus. The dollar at the moment trading against the yen at 102.03, and a quick look at sterling, which is trading against the dollar at 154 and against the German mark at 222.
The government needs to provide targeted investment towards helping the long-term unemployed, according to a report out today from the TUC. Although unemployment has been falling consistently over the last 2 years, figures for the long-term unemployed remain quite high. But critics argue government intervention isn't the solution to the problem. Jonty Bloom reports.
The Trades Union Congress likes to think that it's cast aside its cloth cap and Jarrow March attitude to unemployment, and it's right to. A third of all the long-term unemployed live in the southeast of England and are therefore unlikely to be discarded steelworkers and coal miners. And the TUC's conclusions are wide-ranging, including more training, work placement schemes and part-time work for the jobless in the public sector, while in its pre-budget submissions the TUC also called for £6 billion more public investment. But its critics claim that its analysis is still flawed and tax cuts have a much larger effect on the economy.
It's actually very difficult to work out exactly what people will do when they see a cut in taxes. For example, back in 1988, when the Chancellor cut taxes by £4 billion, people actually increased their spending by £20 billion. And you had the opposite effect when the poll tax came in spring 1990, when the poll tax itself raised about an extra £2.5 billion over what people had expected, and they cut their spending by nearly 3 times that much. So the real life examples do seem to show that tax changes have a big effect on activity.
But the TUC is keen to point out that long-term unemployment is staying stubbornly high, that economic growth alone isn't going to solve the problem. In October 1993, there were over 1 million long-term unemployed. By the end of last year, that had fallen only slightly, while the headline rate was 1/3 lower. By October this year, 850,000 people had still been out of work for more than a year, and the TUC predicts that by October next year, of over 2 million jobless, 750,000 will be long-term.
I think if there is one criticism about what the TUC are saying is I think they should be going much more heavily on the role that government is able to play in stimulating growth, making sure that growth translates to jobs and that those jobs are taken by unemployed people. I think that policy has to be a great deal more robust and vigorous in the coming months to really make inroads into the numbers of people who are out of work.
But for some, any solution may well come too late. 1 in 5 of the long-term unemployed are over 50 and therefore risk the chance of never working again.
And in about 20 minutes' time, I'll be talking to John Monks, the General Secretary of the TUC, about his new report.
And a roundup of some of the other business news this morning. Japan's Finance Minister Masayoshi Takamura has insisted that he won't be resigning despite continuing criticism of his handling of the country's housing loan crisis. Mr. Takamura said his greatest priority was to finish preparing the budget for next year, which will include measures to help firms affected by the collapse of property and land prices. The crisis has left banks and other lending institutions with billions of pounds of bad debts. The film manufacturer Fuji has claimed that retailers accounting for 73% of Japanese film sales have access to Kodak products. The figures were given to the US trade representative in an attempt to prove that Kodak isn't discriminated against. But Kodak says very substantial barriers to market access remain. The film issue threatens the fragile trade relations between America and Japan. The Coca-Cola company has announced the biggest investment programme in its history, with plans to spend £1 billion in the coming year on capital projects around the world, representing a 36% increase on this year's spending. The money will be spent in countries as diverse as Brazil and Russia.
So let's have a little look at the main business stories in the newspapers today. They do certainly have an end-of-term feel about them. The Indie tells us that BT is furious about the industry regulator, Don Cruikshank's plans to change its licence. Oftel is determined to clamp down on unfair competition. BT wants the matter referred to the Monopolies and Mergers Commission.
The Times says 3 former senior executives of Barings Bank are to be questioned by MPs over allegations that they destroyed documents and records of telephone conversations shortly after the bank's collapse.
The singer Janet Jackson is close to signing a multi-million-dollar recording contract with Virgin, according to the FT. The deal, said to be worth £58 million, would be one of the most lucrative ever given to a recording artist.
And The Sun says the dispute over Granada's hostile takeover bid for the Forte Group has forced Sir Rocco Forte and Jerry Robinson to cancel their plans for Christmas for fear of losing points with shareholders.
And it is exactly 6:15. Now, Rob Bonnet is down in Bath, and he will be doing some sports news into Breakfast News a little bit later on. But in the meantime, you have to make do with Janet.
Bad luck. Arsenal's Ian Wright is facing disciplinary action from the FA after describing some referees as incompetent and like little Hitlers. Officials from the FA have written to Wright to explain why he made the comments. Meanwhile, one of the referees specifically criticised by Wright has responded to the accusations.
Referees are human beings, contrary to some people's views, and when you've got human beings making decisions, there will be, on occasions, errors made, there will be differences of perception. So I don't think you're ever going to have an ideal situation where there's no controversy and no dispute.
The First Division management merry-go-round continued yesterday with 2 positions filled, but with another still not confirmed. Martin O'Neill was installed as manager at Leicester after compensation was agreed with his former club Norwich. Lenny Lawrence, formerly at the helm of Bradford, Middlesbrough and Charlton, was appointed at struggling Luton. But Gary Megson has been blocked from moving to Norwich by his current club Bradford. The Yorkshire side are considering legal action to prevent any further moves by the Carrow Road club. England's tour match against a South African-Austrian 11 enters its 3rd and final day in just under 2 hours' time. After the students declared on 269 for 8 yesterday, England's batsmen went on to score 186 for 2, with Alex Stewart hitting an unbeaten 89 on a rain-affected day. Scotland's top rugby players will be able to earn £25,000 for playing for the national side this season. 23 players have been offered contracts which will cost the Scottish Rugby Union a total of more than £500,000. As a result of the offer, Scottish internationals will earn more than Welsh or Irish players, though England, France and the Southern Hemisphere nations are still way ahead in the pay league.
I believe it to be a very fair deal. We've offered the players an opportunity to earn up to £25,000 on the pitch for a 5-month period, and I think that will stack up very well with our friends in Wales and Ireland. We clearly can't compete with England. We haven't got the money to compete and have no intentions of trying to do so with a view to causing financial embarrassment to the Scottish Rugby Union.
And that's quite enough sport for now. Back to Sarah.
Who needs Rob Bonnet, I say. Now, we were hoping to end our racing tips on a high note, but Betty's Boy only managed a 2nd place, I'm afraid, at Lingfield yesterday. That is your lot as far as racing tips are concerned from Business Breakfast until the 2nd of January. And for those of you who don't know, all betting shops are now closed until Boxing Day. And the time, it is 18 minutes past 6. You're watching the BBC's Business Breakfast. The news headlines this morning. European fisheries ministers have reached agreement on fishing quotas after 14 hours of talks in Brussels. They agreed to soften proposals for sharp cuts in quotas next year. 3 men have been killed and 4 others injured in an explosion at an oil rig construction yard on Tyneside. Workers at the AMEC plant at Howden had been testing pressure valves on a gas rig. And the Irish government has dropped plans to release up to 10 IRA prisoners at Christmas because of this week's paramilitary-style killings in Belfast.
In the past year, British business has seen a fevered bout of takeover activity. Some firms were happy to give up their independence, others fought off their suitors tooth and nail. The construction company AMEC is one such business. Just this week, it defended itself against a hostile takeover bid from the Norwegian shipbuilding company Kværner. Well, joining me now from our Manchester studio is Sir Alan Cockshaw, chairman of AMEC. But first, Alan, can I ask you about the accident there's been at one of your plants in Howden and Tyneside this morning? What more information can you give us?
Well, we have very sadly, good morning, very little information at the moment other than to say that one of our lads has been killed and another one seriously injured. It's a very tragic end to the year. Beyond that, I'm sorry, at the moment I have very little detail.
Well, we'll be bringing more detail on that as we get it this morning. Can we move on now to the takeover activity that we've seen in the markets this year? How have you viewed this activity?
Well, insofar as we're concerned, I suppose it only affects you when you see it for yourself. It really concentrates your mind very significantly indeed.
A lot of analysts, a lot of city analysts are saying that businesses are spending so long trying to please the city and please their bankers with this takeover activity that they aren't concentrating enough on their core business. Is that something that you'd go along with as well?
It certainly takes your eye off the ball quite significantly, and you don't have any choice. Having said that, it does give you a great deal of focus. I wouldn't like to have to do it every day, but it's certainly tested us at the end of this year, and winning at the end of it was obviously a great relief to everybody.
We've seen the takeover battle for AMEC from Kværner. Are you happy now that Kværner have gone away? Are we going to see a fresh bid for them in a year's time? Will you still be independent in a year's time?
Well, I think what we've got to do now is we've got to perform. We are in the best position going forward than we have been for some years. We've got the best order book we've ever had, and we have great confidence going into 1996. So we will perform, and they will be very happy with the investment that they've made.
Are you in a position, though, where you had this offer from Kværner, and a lot of analysts were saying it was a very generous offer to fight them off? I mean, the climate that we're in for the construction industry is not hospitable.
Well, I think if you talk about general construction in the United Kingdom, that's right. I mean, in routine projects, there is still a very difficult market. But insofar as the kind of business that we're in, the balance of business between home and overseas, and the work that we're doing in the larger projects, particularly in the oil and gas sector, then there is prospect for moving forward very strongly.
Sir Alan Cockshaw, Chairman of AMEC, thanks very much for joining us this morning.
So, farewell then, Barings Bank, Rumbelows and post office privatisation. 1995 has had its fair share of ups and downs, implausible successes and spectacular crashes. Hopefully it'll go down in the history books for rather more than the christening of the future European currency as the euro or the year of the easily listening revival. But without further ado, here is our very own review of some of the highs and lows of the past 12 months.
There's a great element of people going for death or glory, and in this case the trader concerned went for the wrong option.
This dispute has taken as long as the Second World War to date, and from what I can see from the legal bills, may have cost nearly as much as well.
Many people seem deeply upset about the decision to dispose of Brent Spar in deep sea water. I have to say to the right honourable gentleman that I believe it is the right way to dispose of Brent Spar.
I haven't had a bath or a shower now for 3 months.
If they don't like wine, drink Coca-Cola. Drink Coca-Cola, yeah. Okay?
I really don't know. Everything's in metric that I've just bought and I haven't a
Well, if that's sped by too quickly for you, let me just tell you that you can see it all again in about half an hour's time. Now, in a moment, more details on the European deal on fisheries reached just over an hour ago. That's at 6:30. At 6:35, the latest calls from the TUC for targeted investment to help the long-term unemployed. And as I just said, at 7:10, a rather spectacular guide to the financial year in just 4 minutes.
But that's after all the news, business and weather, wherever you are this morning.
A very good morning. Now the main news from the Midlands. Parents on a Northampton estate where there's been a cluster of leukemia cases will be seeking advice today on how to commission private tests into claims of nuclear contamination near their homes. At a meeting last night, parents of 5 children with the cancer were told by Northamptonshire Health Authority that investigations into the claims showed the contamination is not responsible.
There were angry scenes at a press conference held by Northamptonshire Health Authority when a consultative document investigating clusters of childhood leukemia in the town was released.
I've tried to be as calm as I can, but I can't find myself being calm anymore. There's too many children at stake.
5 children living on the same housing estate in Northampton have been found to have the disease. This compares with the national average of 1 case per 1,500 children. But the Health Authority has decided not to hold a local inquiry.
We thought it would be doing them rather a disservice to go and measure something that, or sort of measure a whole load of chemicals that we then couldn't link definitely back to the illness that their children has suffered.
This hasn't pleased the families whose houses all back onto a railway line. They think there must be a link and want something done. Northamptonshire Health Authority says it will continue to monitor the situation, but the families want answers and have vowed to continue their fight for a local inquiry.
A report published by West Midlands Ambulance Service has revealed a significant increase in the number of assaults on emergency crews. The survey shows that in the last year, 59 members of staff were assaulted, with 27 needing medical treatment. The service says it's liaising closely with the police, as well as seeking independent legal advice on how to deal with the perpetrators. A Shropshire Canine Rescue Centre says it's received dozens of calls from people offering homes for abandoned dogs. The plight of 7 puppies and their mother, abandoned in a cardboard box by the side of the road, has highlighted the problem of the substantial increase in the number of stray dogs being brought into the centre. A home has been found for the puppies, but the centre says, in spite of the recent offers, there are still some fully grown dogs which need homes. Travel news now, and flooding is causing general problems this morning. On the trains, there are problems between the Midlands and South Wales due to flooding in Gloucestershire. Trains between Birmingham and Cardiff are terminating at Gloucester, and alternative services are being provided. And on the roads, the police report several inches of surface water in various parts of the region, as well as heavy spray on the motorways. And finally, the Midlands weather forecast, much milder than of late today. Early temperatures around 5 Celsius, and there's a dull and wet start in the morning with some heavy rain for all parts. Later on today, though, brighter weather will spread from the south, and much of the afternoon will be dry, though there's still a chance of a shower. Very mild, highs around 12 Celsius.
You're watching Business Breakfast with all the news, the business news and the weather. The headlines this Friday morning: European fisheries ministers have reached agreement on fishing quotas after 14 hours of talks in Brussels. They agreed to take account of the needs of the fishing industry and to soften proposals for sharp cuts in quotas next year. 3 men have been killed and 4 others injured in an explosion at an oil rig construction yard on Tyneside. Workers at the AMEC plant at Howden had been testing pressure valves on a gas rig. The ghost of Christmas past and present, the TUC laments hundreds of thousands of long-term unemployed. And another row between BT and Oftel as the industry regulator wants new wide-ranging powers over the company.
On the markets this morning, the Nikkei hits yet another record high for the year. Later in the programme, a look at the best and worst financial performers of the year and your 4-minute guide to the year that was.
You must stay around for that one. It really is quite good, although we say it ourselves. All that coming up, but first a look at this morning's main news story. European Union fisheries ministers have reached a deal to fix the size of catches for next year after 14 hours of talks in Brussels. The British minister, Tony Baldry, said it was a good agreement. It's a compromise between the cuts of up to 50% proposed by the EU's scientific advisers to conserve dwindling stocks and the wish of the ministers to protect the livelihood of fishermen. British trawlermen have been leading a campaign against large-scale reductions.
The Irish government has dropped plans to release up to 10 IRA prisoners before Christmas. It's thought the move is directly related to the murder this week of 2 men in shootings in Belfast, which some security sources have blamed on the IRA. 3 men have been killed and 4 other people slightly hurt in an explosion at an engineering yard on Tyneside. It happened at Howden as workers were testing pressure valves on a gas rig.
The men were on the top floor of the structure. They were testing a network of pipes by putting them under pressure with nitrogen gas. That's non-flammable, but there was a sudden leak which was described as like a bursting balloon. 9 fire engines were called as the module was evacuated. The 4 injured men were taken to hospital. Only a few days ago, AMEC was celebrating victory and fighting off a takeover of the company. They thought it was the setting for a perfect Christmas, but now all attention is focused on this morning's activity. The Health and Safety Executive has already begun an investigation into just what happened here, and in the meantime, all work has stopped on the rig.
Yorkshire Water has suspended supplying water by tanker until the new year. Residents in 2 villages near Huddersfield had complained about the noise and fumes from the tankers. Water was being taken into the area as well as to Leeds and Halifax. The company says it can suspend the operation because reservoir levels have improved slightly. The tankers were brought in to help stop the introduction of rotor cuts in the drought-hit areas. The Colombian aviation authorities say faulty navigation equipment may have caused yesterday's plane crash high in the Andes Mountains. 7 people are now known to have survived, but rescue workers say it's a miracle anyone could have lived through the crash, explosion and fire that killed at least 150 others. The Shadow Home Secretary Jack Straw has expressed concern about the advertising of mail-order knives. He says the adverts enable young people to easily get hold of 10-inch knives. Mr Straw has written to the Advertising Standards Authority asking whether the adverts break its code of practice and what steps it's taking to monitor them. Excuse me. He claims there's a risk that such adverts encourage a culture of violence. And those were the main news stories at 6:33. Back to Sarah.
The government needs to provide targeted investment towards helping the long-term unemployed. That's according to a report out today from the TUC. Although unemployment has been falling consistently over the last 2 years, figures for the long-term unemployed remain high. But critics argue government intervention isn't the solution to the problem. In a few moments I'll be talking to John Monks from the TUC, but first, John T. Bloom reports.
The Trades Union Congress likes to think that it's cast aside its cloth cap and Jarrow March attitude to unemployment, and it's right to. A third of all the long-term unemployed live in the southeast of England and are therefore unlikely to be discarded steelworkers and coal miners. And the TUC's conclusions are wide-ranging, including more training, work placement schemes and part-time work for the jobless in the public sector, while in its pre-budget submissions the TUC also called for £6 billion more public investment. But its critics claim that its analysis is still flawed and tax cuts have a much larger effect on the economy.
It's actually very difficult to work out exactly what people will do when they see a cut in taxes. For example, back in 1988, when the Chancellor cut taxes by 4 billion, people actually increased their spending by 20 billion. And you had the opposite effect when the poll tax came in spring 1990, when the poll tax itself raised about an extra £2.5 billion over what people had expected, and they cut their spending by nearly 3 times that much. So the real-life examples do seem to show that tax changes have a big effect on activity.
But the TUC is keen to point out that long-term unemployment is staying stubbornly high, and that economic growth alone isn't going to solve the problem. In October 1993, there were over 1 million long-term unemployed. By the end of last year, that had fallen only slightly, while the headline rate was 1/3 lower. By October this year, 850,000 people had still been out of work for more than a year, and the TUC predicts that by October next year, of over 2 million jobless, 750,000 will be long-term.
I think if there is one criticism about what the TUC are saying is I think they should be going much more heavily on the role that government is able to play in stimulating growth, making sure that growth translates to jobs and that those jobs are taken by unemployed people. I think that policy has to be a great deal more robust and vigorous in the coming months to really make inroads into the numbers of people who are out of work.
But for some, any solution may well come too late. 1 in 5 of the long-term unemployed are over 50 and therefore risk the chance of never working again.
So, John Monks, isn't the brutal reality that with, as we've just heard in that report, 1 in 5 of the long-term unemployed over 50, they're really not going to get back to work at all, and they're certainly not going to be trained?
Well, I don't think we can write off the over 50s or any of the other 850,000 people who've been unemployed for a year or more and now face at least their second Christmas on the dole. What we've been arguing for are the kind of projects which would put people back to work and would give them an opportunity at least of some work and some training. And we're absolutely confident that it's within affordable guidelines as far as public expenditure is concerned.
With respect, what you're really saying, though, isn't very new, is it? You're not proposing anything that you haven't done in the past.
Well, actually, we're proposing some schemes which have served this country well in the past. In the old Manpower Services Commission days of the early 80s, there was a scheme called the Community Programme, which provided work for the long-term unemployed. And it was a very popular scheme. You didn't need to coerce people to go on it by threatening to withdraw their benefit. They wanted to go on it because it paid a basic minimum rate for the job. We'd like to see that scheme, something very much like it, reintroduced on a big scale.
Now, you also talk about targeted investment. The government would argue that it already does that. What else do you suggest that they should do?
Well, we don't think it does enough of it. We'd like to see an expansion as far as construction projects are concerned, particularly in the hardest hit parts of the country. We're all conscious of transport problems, we're all conscious of the homeless, particularly at Christmas, and we do need some greater provision of social housing and greater investment in public transport. If the investment was shunted in that direction, we're sure, in fact, that it would be going where it was most needed, as well as helping the long-term unemployed.
But again, the government would say that all that they have done has made the United Kingdom the top of the league in Europe as far as inward investment comes to this country.
Well, that's one of the few bright things on the British horizon, that foreigners are investing in Britain. Britons, unfortunately, seem to be investing abroad. And were it not for foreign capital coming into Britain, we would be in a very sorry state indeed. And indeed, I don't think everybody's totally happy about foreigners buying up significant chunks of Britain. Still, I mean, we're happy to see foreign investors come, but it is important to see in those areas where private capital won't cover the gap and won't provoke a rise in employment, that the public intervention fills that particular gap.
Let me just take issue with you on one other area, and that is the whole question of training. There's been a lot of criticism about it as an expensive way of achieving very little.
Well, the reality is that many people who get trained don't have a job at the end of it, and the training itself has been shown under some of the government schemes to actually be rather counterproductive. If you go on a training course, you're out of the labour market, you're not looking for a job, and you're worse off than somebody who's perhaps not on the training course. We actually want to see the training targeted more towards work opportunities, and you've really got to advance work opportunities hand in hand with training.
Let me just switch altogether onto something completely different and ask you what kind of a year it has been for you and everybody at the TUC.
Well, I think the whole year's been dominated by this coming to terms with the change in the way people work. 20 years ago, the typical job was directly employed, full-time, often male employment. Now it's likely to be part-time, temporary, rather casualised, often for women, and it's a terrific change in the way people are working. And while we welcome the increase in women's employment, we are very worried about the decline of the full-time, directly employed person, and I mean, only a minority of young people are now getting that kind of job.
John Monks, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
To the markets now, and a strong performance for equities so far. In Tokyo, the Nikkei hit new highs for the year. At the moment, it's up 91 points. And recovery on Wall Street too, where heavy trading pushed the Dow up almost 40 points, making good most of the 50-point drop on Wednesday. Dealers said the stronger performance was down to a glimmer of hope from the Senate Republican leader Bob Dole that some progress had been made in resolving the US budget crisis. A quiet time on the currency markets, with dealers retiring to the sidelines for Christmas, but that possible resolution of the US budget crisis did offer some stimulus. The dollar is currently trading against the yen at 102.05, and a quick look at sterling, which is trading against the dollar at 154 and against the German mark at 221.
Now let's have a little look at some of the other business stories this morning. BT and Oftel have clashed sharply over plans by the regulator to change the way the telecommunications giant is supervised. Oftel wants the company's operating licence to be reviewed to give it more power to promote fair trading in the industry. But BT has condemned the proposal and may take the issue to the MNC. Excuse me. Japan's Finance Minister Masayoshi Takemura has insisted that he won't be resigning despite continuing criticism of his handling of the country's housing loan crisis. Let me just clear this, thank you. Mr. Takemura said his greatest priority was to finish preparing the budget for next year, which will include measures to help firms affected by the collapse of property and land prices. The crisis has left banks and other lending institutions with billions of pounds of bad debts. The film manufacturer Fuji has claimed that retailers accounting for 73% of Japanese film sales have access to Kodak products. The figures were given to the US trade representative in an attempt to prove that Kodak isn't discriminated against. But Kodak says very substantial barriers to market access remain. The film issue threatens the fragile trade relations between America and Japan. The Coca-Cola Company has announced the biggest investment programme in its history, with plans to spend £1 billion in the coming year on capital projects around the world. Representing a 36% increase on this year's spending, the money will be spent in countries as diverse as Brazil and Russia. And it is just about coming up to, you don't have a clock on your screen, it is coming up to about 18 minutes to 7. And you are watching the BBC's Business Breakfast. The news headlines this morning. European fisheries ministers have reached agreement on fishing quotas after 14 hours of talks in Brussels. They agreed to soften proposals for sharp cuts in quotas next year. 3 men have been killed and 4 others injured in an explosion at an oil rig construction yard on Tyneside. Workers at the AMEC plant at Howden had been testing pressure valves on a gas rig. And the Irish government has dropped plans to release up to 10 IRA prisoners at Christmas because of this week's paramilitary-style killings in Belfast. And time for our usual look at the main business stories in the newspapers today. And of course they do have a rather end-of-term feel about them, as we all do in the studio here. The Times says that 3 former senior executives of Barings Bank are to be questioned by MPs over allegations that they destroyed documents and records of telephone conversations shortly after the bank's collapse.
Singer Janet Jackson is close to signing a multi-million-dollar recording contract with Virgin, according to the Financial Times. The deal, said to be worth £58 million, would be one of the most lucrative ever given to a recording artist.
And The Sun says the dispute over Granada's hostile takeover bid for the Forte Group has forced Sirocco Forte and Jerry Robinson to cancel their plans for Christmas for fear of losing points with shareholders.
Well, to discuss some of the issues in today's newspapers is Bronwyn Curtis, Executive Director and Head of Economic and Fixed Income at Deutsche Bank. Bronwyn, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming in. Let's start with a story that's in most of the newspapers this morning on France, on Alain Juppé's social summit, which looks like it's running into trouble already. Is it inevitable that he won't find consensus?
I think he's in an impossible situation. I mean, he can't help the unions aren't happy with him, the people aren't happy with him, and now the employers are unhappy with him. They've got to cut this social security benefit system, and there's just no way. And this summit, all he did was say we must create another 250,000 jobs by the end of 1996, and there's no way.
And also they're pointing out in this article that French unemployment is rising. There are even talks of France entering another recession, and Juppé is saying he needs to increase the rate of growth. How do you think he should go about doing this?
Well, I mean, he's talking about lower interest rates and some specific measures, but as long as the French franc is tied to the Deutschmark and they're trying to meet the Maastricht criteria, they've got to have tighter fiscal policy, they can't actually do anything about the currency. I don't think there's any way that they can create growth unless the rest of Europe grows.
Okay, so budgetary problems in France and budgetary problems across the Atlantic. A story in the Times on Newt Gingrich, the rebel class of 95, Republican descent, and perhaps now Newt Gingrich might be quite not in as much control as we thought he was before. What do you make of all of this?
I think yet another politician in trouble. I mean, Gingrich came in, really on the crest of a wave, and the Republicans, took over the House, and it was really great. But of course, all these 70 new Republicans are fairly idealistic, and all this toing and froing between the White House and the Republicans in the House over what they're going to do about the budget, they're not really prepared to give way. And so Gingrich looks a bit of a fool, really, I think. Because he comes back from the White House saying, well, I've agreed this and that, and they say, well, no, we want it this way. So he's losing his support.
What do you think the long-term effects of this budget impasses will be in the United States?
Well, I think they will have to agree something, and I think if we didn't think that, then the markets would be in turmoil. So it will happen, but it looks as though it's going to take through most of January now to agree something.
Okay, let's move on to the Financial Times. Personal savings hit a 5-year low. Apparently, we're dipping into our savings to fund spending, and the article is saying that this reinforces the view that consumer spending is the most important contributor to growth, economic growth in this country. What's your view on that?
Well, it usually contributes about 60% of GDP. So, of course, if you have very low savings, people can't spend because they can dip into their savings so far, but you're already at record low levels. It's going to be pretty difficult for the government to reach that 3% growth target next year. It's everywhere, It's not just the UK. In Germany, they have record savings rates, record low savings rates. The US is very low. So people are trying to keep up their standard of living, but there's just not enough growth in the economy to do it.
And finally, a seasonal story. Shopaholics. The government offering help to shopaholics apparently affects 2 to 4% of the population. Talk us through this.
Yes, I don't know whether I thought perhaps the government would have a bit more to spend their money on, a bit better things. I mean, I'm told that, according to Dr. Elliott here, that shopping is a healthier addiction than tranquilizers or alcohol, and only becomes a problem, of course, if the debts are insurmountable. Well, I think that's probably more of a problem than, alcohol and so on. But, yes, I mean, we all like to go out and have a good shop when we're feeling down, but I don't know whether it's worth a government survey and spending money on it.
Okay, Bronwyn Curtis from Deutsche Morgan Grenfell, we apologise. Thanks very much for speaking to us this morning.
Pleasure.
Sarah.
Well, like any year, 1995 had its fair share of winners and losers on the financial markets. In London, the FTSE made solid, if unspectacular, gains, ending last night at 3,633. That's a rise of 18.5% on the year. But that was positively puny compared with the Dow Jones, which ended at 5,096, up an impressive 32%, making it the best performing major market in the world. But the canny investors in Zurich did rather well too. The Swiss all-share index was the best performer in Europe, closing yesterday up 25% on the year at 3,255. Less good news, though, for investors in Pakistan. The Karachi Stock Exchange was the worst performer. It ended last night up 19, but that's actually down 42% on the year at 1,441. Now, the prize for this year's best performing share on the FTSE goes to the computer software firm Unipalm. It ended up 455% on the year at 650 pence. But the wooden spoon goes to the Midlands engineering group Ferrum, or is it Ferrum? And restructuring has sent its share sliding 94% this year to just 1.5 pence. Now, speculating on the health of the pound wouldn't have done you much good. Against the dollar, it has so far this year been down 1.8% on the year, currently trading today at $1.54. OK, that's up 1/4 cent, but down 1.8% on the year. And against the German currency, down even further. It lost 8.7% this year, and it's currently trading at 2 Deutschmarks 22 exactly. And finally, this Christmas, spare a thought for Nick Leeson, languishing in his Singapore jail. You'll remember that he speculated against the Nikkei going up. At the start of the year, it was at 19,519. Then came the Kobe earthquake, and by February the 26th, it was down 10% to 17,472. And that was the end for Barings. Since then, it's recovered and has actually seen a modest rise over the year. Today, it's up 91 points on the day, 19,744. That's enough statistics. Janet's got something much more interesting.
Yes, so farewell then Barings Bank, Rumbelows and Post Office privatisation. 1995 has had its fair share of ups and downs, implausible successes and spectacular crashes. Hopefully it will go down in the history books for rather more than the christening of the future European currency as the euro, or the year of the easy listening revival. But without further ado, here is our own review of some of the highs and lows of the past 12 months.
This dispute has taken as long as the Second World War to date, and from what I can see from the legal bills, may have cost nearly as much as well.
Many people seem deeply upset about the decision to dispose of Brent Spar in deep sea water. I have to say to the right honourable gentleman that I believe it is the right way to dispose of Brent Spar.
I haven't had a bath or a shower now for 3 months.
If they don't like wine, drink Coca-Cola. Drink Coca-Cola, yeah. Okay?
I really don't know. Everything's in metric that I've just bought and I haven't a
See, I told you it was good. Now, not surprisingly, so close to Christmas, we don't actually have a new business diary, but there's always the weather. Here's David Lee at the BBC Weather Centre. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Sarah. Thank you very much indeed. Well, almost always the weather and a lot of rain from the weather today. A large area of cloud here coming across France into the British Isles, so no surprises. A heavy rain warning this morning through the Midlands into Lincolnshire, Humberside and Yorkshire for the next few hours. The radar picks that rain up, moving its way steadily northeastwards. It's a little bit of sleet and snow too across northern parts of Scotland. But the main feature is that rain across England, Wales, into southern Scotland and Northern Ireland. There it is across Northern Ireland, there it is across Wales too, some very heavy rain indeed. But also some clearer weather coming into the southwest, and that's moved across southwestern parts of England too in the last few hours. You can see that clearer weather sweeping its way across Cornwall and Devon. I think by the middle part of the morning it'll be across Wales in towards the Midlands and continue to drift slowly northwards. But across northern Britain still some further rain and still some further snow too across the highest ground. Now as this rain moves north, it's going to get very much milder. Temperatures in the south around about 12 or 13 degrees, about 10 degrees higher than they were yesterday, but still cold and windy across northern areas. So through the morning, some snow in the north, some further belts of rain coming in from the southwest from time to time. In fact, overnight there will be further showers coming up from the southwest. Not raining everywhere all night, but there will be some heavy rain nevertheless at times. With all that cloud and rain, a mild night across most southern areas, but still cold across central and northern parts of Scotland with that strong easterly wind. Now that colder weather is going to start to move back southwards during Saturday. Still some further rain across many parts of England and Wales, but the brighter weather pushing south, and that rain may well turn to snow across some of these southern areas during Christmas Eve, as a lot of snow showers coming to those northeastern areas. And on Christmas Day, many areas dry and bright, but a lot of snow showers around those northern and eastern coast. And severe frost, I think, over the Christmas weekend, particularly there across Boxing Day night. Here's a summary then for today. Cold and wintry in the north, many areas seeing some heavy rain, but drier weather spreading up from the south. That's it from me. Goodbye.
So it really is going to snow on Christmas Day, David. We'll hold you to that. That is just about it from Business Breakfast for this year. We'll be back on Tuesday the 2nd of January 1996, and our sister programme Working Lunch will be back on Monday the 8th of January. So from all of us here, have a very happy Christmas and of course a happy New Year.
However, you haven't quite seen the back of it. Sarah will be back in a moment with Breakfast News, and I'll be back with the market update in around 15 minutes. But before all that, the news, the business and the weather, wherever you are this morning.
Good morning. Parents on a Northampton estate where there's been a cluster of leukemia cases will be seeking advice today on how to commission private tests into claims of nuclear contamination near their homes. At a meeting last night, they were told that investigations by the Northamptonshire Health Authority had dismissed the allegations and had shown no connection between the 5 cases of childhood leukemia. A report published by the West Midlands Ambulance Service shows a significant rise in the number of assaults on emergency crews. In the past year, 59 members of staff were assaulted, with 27 needing medical treatment. The service says it's seeking independent legal advice on how to deal with the perpetrators. West Midlands Police are reiterating their warnings to motorists not to drink and drive. A drinks company survey shows that more people were convicted on drink driving offences in the West Midlands last year than anywhere else in Britain.
Every year, around 500 people die from drink-related accidents. The government has spent millions of pounds in television advertising to try and get the message across. Each year, the adverts become more hard-hitting.
Last Christmas, there were these two kids. He gave them a Christmas they'd never forget.
David, yes, that's my boyfriend.
We'll obviously have extra patrols on the road, and everybody involved in an accident or who commits a moving road traffic offence, for example speeding, will be breathalyzed over the Christmas period.
Some forces in the region will be carrying out random checks on motorists in the run-up to Christmas and New Year.
6 people have been treated in hospital after noxious fumes were sprayed at a nightclub in Stoke-on-Trent. A number of clubbers complained of sore and itchy eyes. The police and ambulance services are still trying to establish what the gas was. A Shropshire canine rescue centre says it's received dozens of calls from people offering homes for abandoned dogs. The plight of 7 puppies and their mother, abandoned in a cardboard box by the side of the road, has highlighted the problem of the substantial increase in the number of stray dogs being brought into the centre. A home has been found for the puppies, but the centre says, in spite of the recent offers, there are still some fully grown dogs which need homes. Travel news. Flooding is causing